Neither side could afford to continue the war. It was time for peace negotiations. His English and French troops had just defeated the forces of Saladin, the renowned Muslim leader. But as the cheers of his knights echoed across the battlefield, Richard felt a profound sense of weariness. Now that hostilities were suspended, they had to consider the logistics of withdrawal. How could they protect their people and their possessions while retreating? It was a crucial question that demanded careful consideration. Richard, ever the meticulous strategist, organized his forces to ensure a secure departure. He knew that any perceived weakness could be exploited by his enemies, and he was determined to maintain his reputation as a formidable leader. Months of relentless campaigning had taken a heavy toll, not only on him, but also on his men and horses. For centuries before this, traveling there had been very hard and dangerous, but now it was easier. Thousands of European Christians went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. You won't believe it. It was the man who should have been on his side, his ally, Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. He had been through a lot, from battles to betrayals and jail time. But as his ship sailed towards England, disaster struck. But Richard didn't want to go to France. He wanted to go home to England. So he made a plan. Richard and his brother, King John, ruled England together. They shared power and made good decisions. But as time went on, King John got greedy. John's guards found him and started attacking the tower. They were safe there, but they knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. He made sure that the land that his brother had stolen was returned to the people. He also made sure that everyone in England knew that he wasn't like his brother. Eventually, they had to come out and face John's army. Richard and Balian gathered more knights to their side and eventually defeated John's army. John fled to a nearby city and locked himself inside. Richard fought bravely, but he was outnumbered and eventually got tired. Just when he thought he was going to lose the fight, a group of knights came to rescue him. They were led by a brave knight named Balian of Ibelin. Balian was a close friend of Richard and he had followed him on his crusade. When the wagon arrived at the castle, nobody checked what was inside. They just assumed it was a sick knight. So when the wagon arrived in England, Richard got out and ran to his father, King John. Richard told John that he wasn't happy with the way he was ruling and that he wanted to change it. He was brave, strong, and always stood up for what he believed in. Even though he died before he became king, he is remembered as a great leader who brought peace and justice to his people. John got very angry and ordered his guards to arrest Richard. Richard's knights were furious and they started fighting against John's guards. The whole castle became a battleground. A storm bigger than any he had seen before tossed his ship around like a toy boat in a bathtub. Finally, his ship landed on the coast of Austria. But unfortunately, Richard had hurt the Austrian duke earlier, so they didn't want him there. Richard was supposed to become king after John, but John didn't want to share power. So he kept making new laws that gave him more power. Richard didn't agree with these laws, so he argued with his brother. They argued so much that Richard decided to leave England and go on crusade to the Holy Land. When Richard was gone, King John became even more greedy. He made more unfair laws and took more of his people's land. They took him off his ship and put him in jail. He quickly assembled a group of knights and began his journey back to England. He wanted to stop his brother's bad behavior. Richard's knights were eager to fight and take back the land that King John had stolen. However, Richard didn't want to cause more trouble. He was hoping that he and John could work things out. And guess who came to see him in jail? Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Yes, the same guy who put him in jail before. He wanted Richard to pay him again, but Richard didn't have any money. So Henry decided to give him a very special gift, a crown. Henry put him in a very uncomfortable wooden box for a bed. He tried to move around, but it was impossible. So he spent many nights in that uncomfortable bed. Talk about betrayal. Apparently, Richard had insulted Henry during the Third Crusade. So when Richard got sick and needed help, Henry decided to teach him a lesson. He threw Richard in jail and said he wouldn't let him go until he paid a huge ransom. The ransom was so big that England almost went bankrupt paying it, but eventually they paid it and Richard was free. Jerusalem remained just out of reach, and the prospect of leaving without achieving his primary goal was a bitter pill to swallow. But while he was there, he got sick. Not just a little sick either. We're talking really, really sick. Richard planned to go back to England, but he wanted to keep fighting, so he stayed in the Holy Land. He knew the Crusaders' longing for Jerusalem, and he was ready to exploit any chink in their armor. Richard wanted to take the city, but he knew he didn't have the strength to do it right now. Instead, he agreed to a compromise. He would give Saladin everything he wanted, except for Jerusalem. The once vibrant troops were now gaunt shadows of their former selves. Their numbers were dwindling, their weapons were dull, and their armor, once gleaming, was battered and dented. Richard felt terrible about having to give up on taking Jerusalem, but he knew he didn't have a choice. After weeks of arguments and counter-arguments, they finally agreed to a treaty. The treaty was called the Treaty of Jaffa. It said that Christians could visit Jerusalem without any problems, but Jerusalem itself would stay in Muslim hands. His army was tired and they needed to get back home. Saladin, too, bore the scars of the battle and the extended conflict. His troops were depleted, his resources were strained, and the bitterness of defeat lingered. Jerusalem, the holy city at the heart of their dispute, remained elusive for the Crusaders. Despite his martial prowess, Richard realized he couldn't go on forever. He understood that continuing the fight would only result in more death and destruction, with no guarantee of success. The thought of his men dying needlessly for a distant Jerusalem weighed heavily on his conscience. He proposed a temporary halt to hostilities, a chance for both sides to regroup and reassess. For Richard, this offer was a lifeline. It provided an opportunity to rest, to recover, and most importantly, to reevaluate his campaign's goals. In the face of these grim realities, and with the prospect of winter fast approaching, Richard accepted the truce. This decision wasn't easy. It meant acknowledging that he hadn't achieved his primary objective, the capture of Jerusalem. But Richard, ever the pragmatist, knew that sometimes strategic retreats were necessary. As the agreement was reached, a palpable sense of relief swept across the battle-hardened soldiers. They had fought valiantly, but even the most courageous warriors need moments of respite. The prospect of a brief reprieve from the horrors of war brought a glimmer of hope to their weary eyes. Yet as the truce took hold and the Crusaders prepared to withdraw, a new set of challenges emerged. After the long and difficult siege, both Richard and Saladin needed a break. On September 2, 1192, Richard, the Crusader King, and Saladin, the Muslim leader, met near the coastal city of Jaffa. But when the Crusaders started to pack up and leave, something interesting happened. Lots of European Christians started going to Jerusalem. Richard the Lionheart is a legendary medieval warrior. But how did he die? When he got back, he was put in jail. Richard was excited to finally be going home. Finally, Henry got bored of making fun of Richard and sent him to another ruler, King Philip of France. When John heard that Richard was coming home, he was so happy that he forgot about all his other problems. One day, Richard went to visit his father, King John. When Richard heard what his brother was doing, he got very angry. When Richard arrived in England, he went straight to see his brother, King John. During the fight, Richard was separated from his knights and forced to hide in a small tower. Together, Richard and Balian led a group of knights out of the castle and into the forest. Richard was now in charge of England and he started making changes right away. Richard ruled England for many years and everyone loved him. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be among the first to know when the next episode drops.